to be kind of back in your lives for a little bit. It's been a long time. It feels like months and months since we've been able to see any of you all and have our events. You know, we've been so lucky to be doing so many events over the last years. It's weird to get out of that habit. So it's great to be here. I'm Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. This is going to be the kickoff of a series we're doing of virtual chats every Monday and Thursday, at least until June, if not beyond June. So we have a pretty amazing lineup. We'll talk about our guest tonight in just a moment, but this Thursday on the 23rd, we're going to be talking to a guy named Connor Knighton from CBS Sunday Morning, who has written a great book about visiting every national park in the United States over a year or so period, and what that was like. And now it's interesting with all the parks kind of semi-closed and people can't even really get out to do camping or whatever. We need those spaces more than ever. So it should be really fascinating. That's this Thursday at 7 o'clock on Zoom, same as this. And then you can look at our Facebook events, or you can look at our website and see the schedule coming up. We have talks about the Electoral College. We have talks about bird watching. We have talks about all kinds of interesting things. We have some novelists coming. We have all kinds of stuff. So we're trying to give you a big wide variety of things to talk about, think about, other than the news and all the craziness that's happening. Hopefully this is a nice respite from the world at large. So thank you for joining. Tonight we are so thrilled to have Casey Schwartz with us to talk about her new book, Attention, a Love Story. This book is one we were hoping to do a little bit, to be honest, and get candid with everybody. Transparency is all what this is all about. We were hoping at some point to do this as a real in-person event, because the book in many ways is about real experiences and kind of breaking away from this ball and chain of the screen life that we're living. But guess what? You know, fate has an ironic sense of humor, and here we are on Zoom talking about it with Casey. We're going to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then hopefully incorporate some questions. You guys can post questions in our Facebook event. You can post them to the conversation here, and we'll hopefully get to a few of those toward the end. So let's give a whatever a Zoom applause welcome to our special guest, Casey Schwartz. And I'll ask you also to switch to a gallery view to see both of us at the same time. So Casey, welcome.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you everyone for tuning in.
Casey, have you ever been to Oklahoma before?
I've never been to Oklahoma before.
I think this will have to kind of count a little bit. You know,
when I come see you, I'm going to count that as my 1.5 trip.
Okay, yeah, 1.5 trips. Congratulations on the book. I'm sure it must be kind of a crazy, surreal thing. You know, you work on this book for years. And then you know, what, a year ago, you start talking maybe about like release dates and when it's going to come out. And then the whole publicity thing you did, I know that's a big, you know, you're filling out your author questionnaire and talking about people you know and what you're going to do and how you're going to promote it. And then all of a sudden the world changes and
right.
You're doing this from your house with your 4-month-old baby. And here we are. What's it been like just to kind of adapt to this new reality for this product that you're putting out into the world?
So interesting, so strange. I mean, I find that on my best days, I can look at it like it's just fascinating and be curious about it. And I mean, you know, it's not just me. Of course, we've all had to reinvent and adapt so quickly. We're just like sort of learning on the go and inventing this whole new way of being and proceeding with our lives on screen. And it's kind of incredible how quickly that's happened.
You know, I think we were talking earlier, I wanted to talk about what was it that made you want to take this story and make it into a book that's about what it's about? Because it feels like the book covers a lot of ground. There's, you know, it's not just about one thing. I mean, it's called Attention, a Love Story. There is some focus on Adderall and some other things that we'll talk about in a moment, but it also, in many ways, is about your whole life. Mm-hmm. How did you kind of narrow the focus down to being kind of this component of it? Was that something that started up here and then you kind of whittled it down? Or was it always like, I want to tell this story from this angle?
No, so this book is about kind of looking for attention, looking to try to understand attention, to try to possess attention, to try to look at certain great writers and thinkers who I think were sort of obsessed by attention. And, I first got the idea to do this book in about, I think it was like 2015, when I thought, okay, what is the thing that most bothers me and most, like, that fills me with a sense of urgency and distress? And it was the idea that, oh, we are giving away our attention so casually to our gadgets and our tech. And, these products have infiltrated our lives, and without blinking an eye, we have agreed to just turn over our minds to these products from Silicon Valley. And so that was the emotional impetus for starting this book. But it's a book about attention, and the thing about attention is that attention penetrates so many different areas of life. What's relevant to attention? Well, what isn't relevant to attention? Work, distraction, love, drugs, art. It's all politics. It's all involved when you start thinking about how attention plays out in your actual lived experience. And so, it was actually hard to narrow down what to include and what to exclude. I wasn't, sitting down to write a book about the neuroscience of attention. Those have been done and done very well. But I really wanted to talk about how it feels to be a person struggling with attention and with distraction, living in the time period that we live in now.
It's interesting. We hear the term FOMO a lot, right? The fear of missing out. And I was thinking about that in its relation to this topic, meaning that only exists, that term, that acronym only really exists because we're so pulled in a million different directions all the time, right? And then the book made me think about the idea that you often hear people talk about, you can always make more money, but you can't make more time. And we only have this amount of time, and we can only, how we choose to spend that time in some ways defines our whole life. And time and attention, I guess, in some ways are the same thing, right?
Exactly. They're precious, utterly limited resources. We know that attention it has such a limited capacity. It can't even compare to the amount of information rushing at it at all times. And so we have to be deliberate with how we spend it, or else we're just going to spend it on whatever rushes in at us. This is all part of the sort of motivation for writing the book, was this attempt to become a little bit more deliberate with where I paid my own attention.
And it's not coming at it from the perspective of some Luddite where it's like, I hate technology and, I want to just be sitting in a garret, writing on it with a quill pen all the time and listening to the Bach's, unaccompanied cello suites or something. It's more about what are we giving up? It's about the transaction, right? It seems like it's like, we are paying some price for this world we're living in. You're saying that the price is our attention. It means we're giving away our time, our most precious thing. Is that something you've always thought? You said 2015, that's 5 years ago, you started thinking about that. Was it the advent of things like the smartphone and other things that started really pushing you in that direction?
We all noticed it happening, of course, much earlier than that. But it was in 2015 that I decided, you know what, even though it seems like it's the battle's over and Silicon Valley has won, I'd still like to take on this subject because I feel like it's one of the big kind of almost like catastrophes of our day, which is this sense that we have lost control. I feel like I'm in as deep as anyone. I mean, I'm in the Instagram trance, way too often. It's not like I'm some Zen master who has found a way to screen out my screens and all of the usual distractions. I am in the thick of this struggle too. And so this book it's not like the message of the book is, throw your phone in the river and sort of retreat to a monastery at all. I hope that the message of the book is just sort of like wake up to where you're putting your attention. And that can cascade change through your life a little bit.
I'm 39, and when I was a kid, it seems like that's about the time when terms like attention deficit and things like that, like in the 80s,
Right.
90s, started to really become prevalent. And it feels like something I've known about. Like it seems like for years it was ADD, and then it became ADHD at some point. And when did that become part of the cultural lexicon? Because it's something everybody knows now. These are acronyms that are just like, it's like the FBI. We know it immediately. When did that kind of start filtering into kind of the popular culture?
Yeah, I think in the 90s, people were still fairly unfamiliar. Like I remember in high school, there was sort of like one or two kids in my class who needed extra time on testing, but the concept of ADD was still unfamiliar and sort of exotic or sort of not well understood. And then suddenly in the 2000s, you see this ballooning of diagnoses, like, I mean, literally millions of diagnoses, I think. And then, immediately followed by prescriptions for stimulants. So I think it was actually, between 2000 and 2010 that it just skyrocketed in the American consciousness.
And the drug of choice, or the drug that everyone knew about initially, was Ritalin. That was the kind of the thing everybody heard about. And then the conversation kind of switched to where you hear the Adderall, right?
Right.
What is Adderall? What is it supposed to do? And how prevalent is it in the culture right now?
Adderall is sort of souped up, amphetamine. It's like the souped up version of Ritalin. Ritalin had always been around. It's older, it's slower, it's not as powerful. Along comes Adderall, which is really this remaking of a diet pill used in the 80s called Obitrol. And Adderall comes on the market in 1996 in the United States. And it offers attention it's a treatment for ADHD. But what's really interesting is, and this is in this wonderful book by a reporter named Alan Schwartz called ADHD Nation, Adderall, the name Adderall, actually was invented in the conference room at Shire Pharmaceuticals, and it means ADD for all. That's where they got that name, because part of the idea is sort of to spread or push the diagnosis a little bit more liberally of ADHD.
To sell more Adderall?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and I think that's been very, very successful, because when I got to college in 2000, Adderall, I had never heard of Adderall or seen Adderall in high school. But when I got to college, suddenly, freshman year, a friend turned to me in our dorm room and said, "Oh, here, I can't stand this Adderall. It makes me want to do cartwheels in the hall." I'd come to her to say, how am I going to get through the book I need to read and the essay I need to write by tomorrow? And she held out this tinfoil ball and pulled out this blue pill, and I'll never forget it. And, I took it that first night, and it was sort of it felt like a key in the lock, because suddenly you're up all night, you have incredible energy, stunning focus. Your work is like the only thing you would ever want to be doing is the work in front of you. And, it felt like a miracle. And that was, for me, that was my introduction to this so-called attention drug. And I say so-called, I mean, for some people with ADHD, it's a profound help. For many others, I think it's used off-label, it's abused. Maybe they do have ADHD, but they're taking way more than they're prescribed. There's just so much slippage and gray area when it comes to these stimulants. And I know I sort of fell into the Adderall trap myself and wound up taking it for almost a decade, more than a decade, actually. So I was 30 by the time I got off of it.
Yeah. So talk about, you talk about that initial moment, like many drugs, right? You have that kind of initial aha, wow, this is unbelievable moment. How quickly were there returns diminishing on that? And how did you have to change the prescription? Did you have to kind of to keep up with the
right,
the demand?
Well, I mean, all through college, I didn't have a prescription, but the thing is that Adderall was sort of, suddenly you could get it, you knew certain people who had it. There was a barter system. There were all kinds of ways to get Adderall. And, I always had this sense of I need to always have a stash of Adderall, but at the same time, it's a dangerous road to go down. And I was always aware of that. And then it was insanely easy to get my own prescription. It occurred to me when I was just out of college. Oh, I could actually just go see a psychiatrist and respond in a certain way to his questionnaire and get my own prescription. And, the thing is that it's very easy to tell yourself, actually, I really do need help concentrating. And, maybe I do sort of have ADHD. It's sort of like, it's not as if it's so clear necessarily that you do or you don't, especially I feel like now when we're all so splintered on our screens. And it's very sustained concentration is all the more difficult anyway. And that was what happened. I went to this psychiatrist, I think I was 22, and within 40 minutes I had gotten this prescription. And I would then spend my entire 20s taking this pill that I thought was giving me incredible focus, and that I thought, oh, I'll never be able to concentrate or focus if I stop taking this pill. And then, needless to say, it was sort of the opposite was true, which was that it took me farther and farther away from clarity. And it wasn't until I got off the pill when I was 30 that I felt like, oh no, now I get what I'm trying to do. And now I can actually sit down and face my work.
Did you feel any sense of loss that you'd kind of given away a decade to this drug, and that you'd maybe, even though you thought you were being more productive, that you maybe missed some opportunities because of it?
I feel to this day a profound loss of my 20s. That I feel like for some reason I felt the need to, like, this is a drug for people who want to be super high achievers. It's not a drug for disconnecting from your life. It's sort of the ambitious person's drug. But I don't know why I had to turn my 20s into such a urgent, serious, sort of grim, joyless pursuit for something. I mean, isn't that time period more about exploring and failing and figuring things out? And I think I sort of altered the tone of that whole decade in a way that, I really do regret.
Let's talk for a second about Adderall and even just ADHD and all these things, and how they're kind of connected to socioeconomics, meaning the people who, you see who have maybe an issue with this or abusing these certain pharmaceuticals. There's oftentimes, buckets of who these people are. It's, there's a wealth gap, there's a racial component to these things, like the things that are afflicting different groups. You said this is about for people who are trying to achieve things. It's like the ambitious person's drug. Do you think in the larger, I don't want to get on a conversation here about the war on drugs necessarily, but we have been having more conversations about pharmaceutical drugs and where that falls into the conversation with narcotics and other things. Do you see how these white collar drugs in some ways are treated differently in the criminal justice system than any other drug?
I'd actually like to see the data on that, because yes and no, because I feel like, there are many contexts in which it's a lot easier to give a kid Adderall than, for instance, to think about treating him more holistically and in a more ongoing way and a more expensive way for ADHD. So I'm actually not totally sure about the wealth gap when it comes to Adderall, and I would love to actually see the numbers about it, because I could easily imagine an 11-year-old kid in a rural setting without money or access to psychologists being handed prescription speed by the only GP he has access to. So, I mean, I actually wouldn't want to assume exactly who's taking it.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's because sometimes the name of things, you think about to the 1980s. I was thinking about how you're talking about the drug for ambitious people and how cocaine was associated with like Wall Street and kind of that kind of thing. And then you had crack, right, which was associated with poverty and the inner city, both cocaine, right?
Yeah.
Two different things, same drug in a way, very different worlds, right? So,
and actually they're both very similar to Adderall in a way. I mean, methamphetamine and Adderall are like almost identical.
yeah. And you look at like the kind of national profile of something like methamphetamine, and you see something like Hillbilly Elegy or something like that. And you see how those things get kind of put into different buckets based on what they are. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but it's just interesting to me.
It is interesting.
Talk about, I don't want to get too much into craft here, but talk about attention wise. It takes a lot of attention to write a book. And how did you get started, and how were you devoting the time you needed? Because I think a lot of people want to write books and they always try to do November National Novel Writing Month or whatever, and they can't, and they just hit a wall, and a lot of people just get distracted by life. How did you kind of find the time to do this book?
I decided I was going to do it. So I had a book deal that enabled me to set aside the time to do it. So that was a huge privilege and a huge stroke of luck. But for me, it's just the easiest thing to sit down for the first 2 or 3 hours of the day. That's the only time of day that I can write anything even remotely decently. And so if I know, that's my little trick. It's just an automatic out of bed cup of coffee at the computer.
I'm assuming that's not happening as much now with a 4-month-old baby.
That's a little bit temporarily suspended.
Yeah. Although you're probably up a lot more, so you have maybe more time. So talk about. I'm just curious. Screen time. Are you kind of a person who writes on like a legal pad? Are you writing on a computer? Are you trying to avoid the screen while you're writing?
No, I mean, my handwriting, and I'm sure other people who are listening might be able to identify that the fact that, my handwriting is now completely illegible. I can't even read my own handwriting. Yeah. So, no, listen, this is the contradiction of our moment. Especially in this Corona moment, is that we are so thankful for our screens right now, right? We would be lost without them. Our jobs could not continue. We would have no sense of family and community. We'd have to rely on telephones. But at the same time, I think a lot of us are asking sort of, how do we protect ourselves from information overload and screen overload in this moment? And, so it's like, for me, I'm in the 21st century, Jeff. Yeah. I'm ambivalent about it, but I'm here. So yes, I'm writing on a computer.
Yeah. One of my favorite things you were talking about is the idea of looking back kind of from a historical perspective on the role attention has played for other artists and other kind of notable figures. Famously, you think about someone like Balzac, who would drink 100 cups of coffee a day, right? Kind of keep working. And I think in some ways, maybe, I can't remember exactly, died because of drinking too much coffee, or, like ate a hole in his stomach and died from drinking 100 cups of coffee a day just to keep working and keep producing. Can you talk a little bit about some of the research you did into kind of the history of attention a little bit?
Yeah, well, attention had never really been singled out as like worthy of study until the end of the 19th century. And then it became kind of a hot topic. And people started to ask basic questions about it. Things like, hey, can you pay attention to 2 things at once? Or are you always sort of shifting between them, and it became like William James is kind of the most famous example of a philosopher and a psychologist who made attention this grand subject in its own right. And for him, it was sort of, attention was how you gave meaning to your life. It's like attention defined your days. Attention defined where you put your energy, where you put all of your focus, right? So it became this huge topic at the end of the 19th century, and then kind of faded out again in the 20th, and then had another resurgence. And, now, of course, it's an incredibly salient topic that neuroscientists are studying all over the world. And we think of attention now. The most powerful and most common metaphor for describing attention now is a spotlight. It's where we throw our spotlight on some aspect of our environment or our inner world. And that's where we hold our gaze, right? That's the metaphor you hear most about attention. And we know so much more about it, obviously, than was known 130 years ago. But it's still kind of an enduring mystery, you know, from a brain point of view and from a psychological one too.
You know, it seems like for a long time that the concept of attention was in some ways tied into like a bigger concept of human existence and neglect, meaning like people who maybe grew up, you know, say, well, I wasn't paid enough attention to as a kid. I didn't get enough attention from my parents. I didn't get enough X, Y, Z. The teachers didn't pay enough attention to me, whatever. I remember having those conversations. That seemed like something that was a dialogue that would be happening at some time. But now it's kind of shifted to where it's more about attention in relation to content or inanimate objects or something else, but not on that kind of human to human level.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Like, in other words, like, you're right, attention has been so commodified.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's like how people make money on Instagram. How many people are paying attention to that?
Yeah.
It's completely part of, you know, one's brand. But actually, Jeff, that's such a poignant question because, you know, like when you see someone posting a selfie, which I guess most of us are guilty of doing, it's sort of like, what are we saying? We're saying like, please love me.
Yeah.
Please affirm me. You
Yeah.
know, please make up for something I'm lacking in this moment. And that lack is maybe lacking kind of love.
Right. So
I
it's kind of like,
it does go back to those childhood things. Of
like, so like the technology changes, but in some ways the human needs remain the same. They just kind of change their delivery system, I guess, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. What did you, I guess you didn't set out to have some kind of mission statement for this book. This was not like, I'm going to solve X problem with this book. I'm going to do that. And the book is very much about you. Like, I don't want people to think that the book is about, this is not like Mark Kurlansky's book about the history of codfish or something like that. This is like, this is very much a memoir. It's very much about you. And there's some very, very personal stuff in the book. Do you struggle at all with talking about yourself in a public forum, which a book is a very public forum?
No, you know, like, it's a funny thing. You know, I don't know if this happens. I suspect it does happen to other writers, but when you're writing or when I'm writing about myself, it's like I'm sort of looking at myself as a character from a distance. So it's almost like I can fool myself into thinking, no, it somehow doesn't feel quite so private.
Almost like a third person kind of situation.
Yeah, you're sort of like hovering above yourself, you know, like, oh, and then she did this and she did that, and sort of recalling these other periods in your life that you're no longer in. Yeah. But then the book comes out and someone says, my God, this is so private. Yeah. And then you think, oh my God, it must be very private. You know, I hope I haven't like scandalized anyone with how private it is. But like, I think that maybe there's a kind of mental gymnastics when you're actually writing that it somehow feels, you know, less private.
When you're taking on a topic like this, have you had any reactions now that the book is out? And I know you've done some other events and things like that. Have you gotten any sense from people that they feel judged at all by the book?
Oh my God, I hope not. And, you know, if they do, I would tell them, you know, that I was in as deep into the world of distraction as they are. I mean, the opposite of what I hope they feel is judged. I feel like we are in this struggle together. We're all in our phone addiction and our tech addiction together. Yeah. So I mean, no one said that.
Yeah. Right. This is not prescriptive. This is not trying to fix your life or do anything like that. I think we do live in a culture though, where we are bombarded with books and quick ways to fix your problem. You know, this is not that. This is,
and actually, like, you know, and I feel a pressure, like, I think there's a sort of pressure for me to say like, oh, here's a great screen time tip, put your phone in grayscale or something.
Right. And you're not supposed to be an expert on these things. You're just writing about you,
I mean, they are interesting to hear about, but
Yeah.
I really didn't want to write a prescriptive book because I also think attention is such a richer topic than that. And it's not
I
just
appreciated
about,
it. It didn't feel like a TED talk,
well, thank you. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not just about, screen time, right? It's about attention goes to every aspect of our life. It goes to how we treat each other. It goes to how it is to fall in love with someone, how we think about politics. It so transcends the topic of screen time that I would never want to get mired in that particular conversation, although I think it is very important.
What is something that you feel like in your life you've given the most attention to that you regret the most?
Oh my gosh, what a great question. Oh, I worry about everything.
Yeah.
And it is so pointless. I can't even tell you how many things I was worried about just in January. In February, I was so worried, were we going to have to relocate to Los Angeles this spring? This was my big worry. Suddenly we're having a pandemic, the world's upside down, and all of the obsessive worries and focuses of attention are just utterly irrelevant. And by the way, I would do anything to have them back again.
Yeah.
But I can't tell you how much time and focus I've wasted on my various worries over the years.
Well, to flip that question around again too, what's something that you wish you would have put your attention into in the time that you spent worrying about things?
I could have learned 6 languages in the time that I spent worrying about things, and I wish I had.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure that is one of the universal things that is going to make people like the book, I think, is because whatever it is, and worry is probably a very universal one, unfortunately, but we all have that thing, I think, that we obsess about that takes so much of our time. And we know when you're doing that worrying, you probably know deep down that you shouldn't be worrying about it and that it probably is not the best thing you should be putting your attention to. But then again, we're humans and we can't fix that in the moment, right? It's all kind of in retrospect.
The pandemic has forced us. It's like, the funny thing is, it's like forced us into the absolute here and now, because we cannot plan for 1 second any aspect for the months and weeks ahead. So there's nothing but this actual moment we're in. It's like this incredible exercise in paying attention to the now.
No.
It would be impossible to make a plan for 2020.
And does that fill you with a sense of anxiety, or have you reached a place where you feel like, let's roll with it and see what happens?
Again, on my best days, I'm in a spirit of like, fuck it, we're doing this, we're here, there's nothing to be done, let's go for it.
I think that's true. I mean, I think the term of the age right now is vacillate. We're going from one thing to the next. There are mornings when I wake up right now and feel completely invigorated by the challenge of this moment and think like, we're going to take this and we're going to figure it out. And if we do, everything else from here will seem easy by comparison, and we'll know that we could get through this thing because we did this. But then the next day you don't want to get out of bed, right? So
it's so funny how it's such an emotional swing like that. Exactly.
Yeah. And that can be, hopefully we'll learn something from that. So one thing go ahead, I'm sorry.
But I was going to say that I think a common thread in this moment of pandemic is that people are really struggling to concentrate and to pay attention. Because I've been doing some interviewing, and it just seems like focus right now is very aspirational. It's like, it's not exactly Shakespeare writing King Lear in quarantine. I think people can barely read right now. And I think, part of that is because we're so flooded with uncertainty and anxiety, we literally can't hold in our working memory what we still care about and want to focus on. It's very biological.
I'm going to incorporate a couple of questions while we're doing this from some of our audience. There's one here that says, have you explored the, quote, mindfulness movement while you're thinking about attention, or the contemplative traditions of prayer in both Christian and non-Christian practice? Meaning, mindfulness in its bigger sense is about trying to take a moment
Yeah.
and focus. Is that something that's part of your life or your research?
It's not hugely in the book, although it is a tiny bit. I'm very intrigued by mindfulness. I've tried to practice it at a number of different points in my life, learning different meditation techniques. But I decided not to take it on for this book because I felt so unqualified. Because I think if you're going to write about meditation, well, it's really got to be something you've done, you've internalized, you've studied. I mean, it's years of work, and so many people have already written about it so brilliantly that I felt like it's best that I don't include it in this book. But I do think it's an incredibly powerful technique.
You mentioned that the concept of attention has been written about and kind of had moments where it was written about a lot, even 100 years ago. What do you think you're kind of able to do with this book that wasn't addressed in probably a bunch of the other books you read on the topic as you prepared for this book? Is there something other than the fact that it's you and you're different than everybody else?
Well, I think I wanted to show kind of like a modern collage of how many spheres attention has become kind of relevant to or integral to. And like it's kind of weird that in the book I include a couple chapters on psychedelic science, for example. Like that may not seem like an obvious choice, except that it's springing up, I believe, at a time when people are really craving like a different consciousness, a different mental content.
You're talking about micro dosage and things like that?
Yeah, microdosing and ayahuasca and all these kind of psychedelic substances that people are seeking out now. And part of the reason is that they're craving to be in the moment again. So I wanted to include in this book not just a picture of splintered attention, but also a picture of people's attempts to patch themselves back together again. And I think, I also hope that I managed to convey how much attention has meant to thinkers and writers over the years. And how it like as the stakes for these people like David Foster Wallace and Aldous Huxley and Simone Weil, like for them, attention was sort of like the most important faculty in some ways. It's the most important thing you can do as a human being is to take yourself out of yourself and look around you at the people around you and ask like, what is your story? What is your situation? Like, tell me.
Yeah.
And like I think that genuine, deep curiosity and disciplined curiosity is the opposite of what we do when we're online on Twitter, writing each other off and disqualifying and canceling. There's the impulse to say, wait, let me better understand where you're coming from is the opposite of how so much of online discourse is now. And I think to me that is about the ethics and the stakes of paying attention.
My parents both same job basically their whole life, and there was a generation of people, probably especially in some ways it probably ended with the baby boomer generation, who like their parents before them and most people before that would get into some profession and that would be their job, and usually stayed in the same city, and for the most part a lot of times stayed in the same house. And you look at the trends now where people are not keeping the same job or at least at the same employer for more than 6-8 years. There's a lot of moving going around. There's all those things. Do you see those kind of migration patterns in terms of where we work, where we live, as a larger part of our attention problem?
I don't know. Isn't there some interesting study that says people are happier if they do stay where they're from?
Maybe it's like the thing about people in the 1980s got divorced a lot faster than they are right now. And you read some articles, they say, well, what's the secret? And they say, just stay married. It's just
right.
like,
just don't get divorced.
Don't get divorced. You just have to kind of get through those moments. So there may be something to that, but you wonder if that kind of restlessness
right
is tied in with this, or it could be an economic thing. There could be a lot of other reasons, but
well, I mean, there used to be this theory that like Americans are ADD because they were the ones that left the old country. They were like the restless disruptors who came.
Manifest destiny.
But I have to say that I don't really buy into that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's get specific for a couple of things on, we're all sitting at home, we're watching tons of Netflix, we're doing all these things. People say that we don't have big attention spans, but somehow we're able to sit through 5 episodes of one show at one time. And people will say, well, hey, look, I can sit through this. I can watch, The Wire for 5 hours straight or whatever. But is that a misnomer because you're actually watching it while you're playing with your phone and while you're doing 10 other things? It's not really paying attention the way we should be thinking about it.
I think it's I have to be honest here, Jeff, that I think it's a bit of a sad state if we're patting ourselves on the back for being able to watch 5 hours of television. Okay. I mean, we all know that that's not really, what we mean when we say like effortful, voluntary, sustained concentration, right? You can watch TV. I mean, by the way, like I'm married to a TV writer. I love TV. It's like a part of our life, but it's I don't think that being able to sit in front of the television is the mark of someone who has refined their attention. Exactly.
Well, a good real world example of this actually would be, last year the film The Irishman comes out on
Right.
Netflix. It's 3.5 hours long, and people are just saying, I can't make it through the whole thing. This is like Martin Scorsese, master filmmaker, amazing stars. And people who are used to watching hours of stuff on Netflix say, I can't get through this in one sitting. Now, the idea is like, well, guess what? Some of the Harry Potter movies are 3 hours long. You could get through those. That to me seemed like a real interesting moment where it's like, wait a second. Why can't you sit through 3 hours?
Well, I mean, I thought the anxiety was more about like, if you're seeing it in the theater, will you have to use the bathroom?
Yeah, I did see it in an actual theater, and I made it through okay. But
Me
like
too.
we think about these things like, Lawrence of Arabia was 3.5 hours long, and people weren't freaking out about it back then. So you do wonder if these things start to become little kind of pieces in the mosaic of our larger problem with attention.
Definitely. I mean, and you're right, and the discomfort of you're right. I mean, I think people were genuinely scared and uncomfortable by its length.
Let's talk about big books for a second, because you're reading one right now.
Yes.
And it's a book that was a finalist for the Booker Prize last year by I think an American author who lives outside of America.
Right. I don't know that much about the author herself, Lucy Ellman. But
I think she lives in Europe somewhere, but she's American, I think.
That would make sense.
Yeah.
The book is Ducks, Newburyport.
Ducks, Newburyport.
Ducks, Newburyport. And it's written as one long sentence of 1,000 pages long. And I cannot explain why it's this book that is the first book I've been able to focus on since the pandemic started. And it's just this inner monologue of this housewife in Ohio. And she's just kind of like letting us know all of her worries and sadnesses and observations in the stream of consciousness. And there's something about being bombarded by someone's consciousness that feels perfect for this moment, because it's almost like seeing your own mind on display.
So this book, when it was, I think it was nominated for the Booker Prize, was on the short list, finalist. It got a ton of praise. It kind of came out of nowhere. Most people had never heard of the author. I'd never heard of the author before. And it's this giant tome. And of course, the thing was about this sentence. But do you feel it's a gimmick? Does it seem gimmicky to you?
No, not when you read it, because the voice of it is so irresistible and compelling, and like just. It's hard to explain, you just pick it up and suddenly it's in such an authentic voice that I don't know if I'm going to make it the 1,000 pages. We'll see how long the pandemic lasts, but I have to say I'm loving it.
So when it comes to books and attention, right? It doesn't seem like, well, let me reverse it like this. I remember working in bookstores years ago when the Harry Potter books were coming out. And they kind of came out right in that window before e-readers and iPhones came out. Like, I think the last Harry Potter book maybe came out when the Amazon Kindle came out, somewhere right around there. So it kind of beat that ebook world by a little bit. And those books became increasingly longer, if you remember when they were coming out. And we would have kids come in who would buy that book and they would read it overnight and come back in the next day and say they read
Wow.
it. And I wonder, you look at YA books, there's a lot of long YA books, and you see younger people reading fairly long books and series, lots of series, That to me seems like a good sign, for kind of a generation to come. Do you see any patterns or hope? Do you have any hopes kind of about the reading public, about our attention span and how much we'll be able to sustain?
I hope that we'll keep reading. I hope my 4-month-old son will fall in love with reading like I did when I was a child. Because reading in so many moments in your life when things are just really bad, you can always turn to a book. I mean, how many times has that happened to you? Like when it just seemed like things were just really, really bad. And yet you can kind of find refuge in a book. This is, it's not just about, reading as some kind of like intellectual pursuit. It's like, it's so much deeper than that.
One of our viewers is asking a question about the relationship between attention and impulsivity, and specifically related to how the brain is wired, meaning
Yeah.
Is it something you can actually control? Is it an impulse that is just beyond your control? Talk about that for a moment.
You mean is attention beyond your control, or
attention, and is your lack of attention related to impulse control?
Definitely. And, you can think of attention as kind of a cognitive muscle that actually you can work on and beef up. But we all know that sort of inner surging, roiling state of like that of agitation that actually is like much harder in some ways to tame and tamp down than distractions coming from the outside world. And I think, focused attention is pitted against and sort of tries to tame that inner roiling feeling of like, well, you're just so swept up in some craving or some almost unconscious emotional state. That is a brain wiring, partially a brain wiring. And they can even see on scans that it's like this, I think it's like in the left prefrontal cortex area can work to tamp that down.
Yeah. I want to just wrap up with a couple of things. I will say this to anyone who's watching, there's a link here in the comments. You can buy Casey's book. We have a link also at magiccitybooks.com. You can just click it real easily and buy a copy of this great book, and hopefully spend some time focusing your attention on this book for a while. Mm-hmm. I guess just to wrap up, I would say, what do you think in this moment, because we're all so restless, right? We're all so restless. And I guess in some ways we have the time to pay attention more than ever right now to things. But at the same time, we feel this restlessness. What are you doing to kind of focus your attention on things right now? Are you reading more?
No, in part because I have this baby.
Well, yeah.
But I try to do this little exercise where I push him around the neighborhood in a stroller. And I just try to notice and then later write down some of the most surreal details of this pandemic moment. Like one of them that's really sort of stuck out to me is that at the Greek restaurant around the corner, the tables are just set perfectly for dinner. And it's like, I'm just going around the neighborhood trying to think like, what are the details I want to record and remember about this unbelievable, extraordinary moment we're living through. So that when I look back in 10 years, it's like, can be a visceral recreation. That's been my little attention exercise.
Yeah, I think that when I talked about earlier, the idea that there are moments that feel invigorating about this, it's because it feels like you're living history, right?
Right.
Your day-to-day life doesn't feel momentous usually. But when you're in a moment that you kind of know will be historic, it does kind of you talked about the spotlight. It shines a spotlight on the moment in a certain way.
Yeah. Exactly, Jeff.
Yeah. Well, I want to say a big thank you to you for
Oh,
taking
thank you so much for having me. It's been
to chat
wonderful.
with us. And yeah, and I hope everybody will buy a copy of the book and review it. Send Casey some great reviews on wherever you post your book reviews on Goodreads or wherever you're sharing about what you're reading. And tell us about it too. Tell us on social media how much you like the book. If you have other questions, maybe we can get those to Casey somehow too. But thank you guys all for watching. And we'll hope to see you at some of these other upcoming events. Thank you, Casey. We really
Thank you,
appreciate
Jeff. Take care of yourself.
it. Take care. Come see us sometime. Bye-bye.
I love that. Bye.
All right, everybody. Take care of yourselves. We will see you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.